Namaskar, you're watching Vantage. I'm Akanksha Swarup. Ukraine has finally kicked off its counter-offensive. It isn't a big bang operation yet, at least not at the moment. Ukraine is conducting missile attacks, shaping operations designed to break the Russian defenses before an all-out attack. There's no room for mistakes. Kyiv only gets one chance at this. If it fails, it could be forced to compromise on Russia's terms on the negotiating table. So what is Ukraine's game plan? Tonight, we'll get you the specifics. Also on the show, ahead of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the US, there's a call for India to join hands with the NATO should New Delhi go ahead. We'll tell you all about the proposal. China's Wuhan is naming and shaming borrowers to get their money back. And the water in the world's famous canals of Venice has suddenly turned green. The world is scratching their heads for an answer. All that and much more coming up in the next 60 minutes. I'm Akanksha Swarup, filling in for Palki Sharma. First up, the headlines. Japan puts its missile defenses on alert. It comes after North Korea informed Tokyo of an upcoming satellite launch. Pyongyang says the launch will take place between 31st May and 11th June. Japan vows to shoot down any projectile threatening its territory. Kingmaker Bola Tinubu sworn in as Nigeria's president. He succeeds Muhammadu Buhari, a former general who stepped down after 2 terms in office. Nigeria is Africa's most populous nation and is facing a sea of economic troubles. It's election season all around. Spanish Prime Minister calls for snap elections. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez says the surprise elections will be held on July 23rd. The move comes after his party suffered major setback in local and regional polls. PricewaterhouseCoopers Australia places 9 partners on leave. It also overhauls its governance board. PwC Australia is under fire over the leak of confidential government tax plans. The Australian police have begun a criminal investigation into the matter. And Shanghai records its hottest May day in 100 years. The biggest Chinese city shatters the previous high by a full degree. Scientists say global warming is aggravating the adverse weather. Many countries are experiencing deadly heat waves with temperatures hitting record high. It has begun. Ukraine's much-awaited counter-offensive is underway. Kyiv made the announcement in a rather dramatic fashion.
Україна, рідна земля мати, Господь, Отець наш Небесний, благословіть.
Благословіть!
Я йду знищувати!
Ворогів землі рідної! Вбити моїх братів! Гвалтівників моїх посестер!
Нехай рука моя буде твердою!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Нехай око моє буде ясним!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Нехай зброя моя буде справною!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Нехай воля моя буде сталь!
Щоб вбивати ворогів!
Україно, рідна земля мати!
Господь, Отець наш Небесний!
Благословіть!
Наш рішучий наступ! Нашу священну помсту!
Нашу святу перемогу!
Yes, a Hollywood-styled video to announce the counter-offensive. But Ukraine is going to need more than that. This is perhaps Zelensky's last chance. The war in Ukraine began 15 months ago. So far, Russia has dictated the pace of this conflict. Kyiv is trying to turn the tables. It wants to gain an upper hand and push Russia into submission. That's the objective of Ukraine's counter-offensive. Kyiv has spent months preparing for this. The expectations are high. So what are Ukraine's plans? Tonight, we'll tell you. We begin with what's happening on the ground. Ukraine says preliminary operations are underway. There is a spike in missile attacks by Ukraine. Where? Inside Russian-occupied territories. Those areas that Ukraine calls its own. Ukraine is hitting Russian military positions there. An advisor to Zelensky has spoken out. He says, and I quote, It's a complicated process, which is not a matter of one day or a certain date or a certain hour. It's an ongoing process of deoccupation, and certain processes are already happening, like destroying supply lines or blowing up depots behind the lines. So, those are the targets. Russian military command centers, supply depots, basically anything that helps the Russian forces maintain their positions. This is Russia's military infrastructure on the front lines. Ukraine is trying to dismantle it. The goal is to weaken the Russian forces before the Ukrainian troops can move forward and engage the Russian troops in direct combat. This is what military strategists call, quote-unquote, shaping operations. What are shaping operations? These are a set of military tactics. They are used ahead of a major offensive, either to weaken the enemy or to distract them on the battlefield. Ukraine could be trying to do both. With its own shaping operations, what will be Kyiv's next step? They're not saying much, presumably to retain the element of surprise. But reports say Kyiv's focus will remain on the east and south, where the Russian forces have dug in. I'm talking about this area. From Crimea in the south to the Donbass in the east, this entire region is in Russian control. Ukrainian forces will strike in these areas. That's a guarantee. What do they hope to achieve? Kyiv has a specific aim for this counteroffensive. They want to influence the outcome of the war. What are the possible scenarios? Number one, Ukraine's counteroffensive is successful. That would mean Russia losing control of occupied territories. Russian forces will be forced to move back, and Kyiv will regain complete control of lost lands. That's unlikely, because Russian forces still have considerable resources to hold their ground. Scenario number two is a partial victory for Ukraine. What would that look like? Ukraine regains some of the lost territories. With that, they push Russia to negotiate. In that situation, Ukraine would have the upper hand, and they'll be able to dictate terms with some help from its Western partners. Scenario number three would be a failed offensive. That wouldn't play out well for Kyiv. If the counteroffensive fails, Western support for Ukraine will certainly decline, and they could be forced to accept a deal on Russia's terms. So the stakes are high for everyone. Russia is putting pressure on Ukraine. It has intensified attacks on Kyiv. Once again, several explosions were heard this morning. Overnight, Russia launched 40 cruise missiles and about 35 drones. There were no casualties, but some buildings were left damaged. Zelensky has spoken out. He says his country suffered the largest Russian attack yet.
Today, our state went through one of the largest Russian attacks by Shahed drones, 54 drones at a time. Almost all of them were shot down. Unfortunately, there were some hits in the Zhytomyr region. We will do everything to help restore what has been destroyed.
Zelensky is now pushing Ukraine's parliament. He wants sanctions against Iran. Don't know how much will that help. Meanwhile, Russia has issued fresh threats to the West. This is overtraining Ukrainian pilots on F-16 jets. Russian foreign minister called this an unacceptable escalation.
Of course, this is an unacceptable escalation. I think that there are still reasonable people in the West who understand this. But everything is dictated by Washington, London, and their satellites that are inside the European Union, primarily the Baltic countries, Poland, who are implementing the task set by the United States on the ground to weaken Russia, to inflict a strategic defeat on it.
So that's the message from Russia. Expect the war of words to intensify as Ukraine pushes ahead with this counteroffensive. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is set to visit the US next month. There's a lot on the agenda, from trade to security to Ukraine. But ahead of the visit, a US House panel has made an interesting pitch. It says India should join the NATO plus arrangement. I know you must have a lot of questions, like what is this House panel? What is NATO plus? And should India join it? Let's start with the first question. The proposal was made by the House Select Committee on the strategic competition between the US and the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, it's a mouthful, but it's more commonly called the China Committee. And what has this committee said? Let me quote. Including India in NATO plus security arrangements would build upon the US and India's close partnership to strengthen global security and deter the aggression of the CCP across the Indo-Pacific region. So that answers the first question. Secondly, what is NATO plus? Think of it as NATO's extended family. Right now, there are 5 NATO plus members: Australia, New Zealand, Israel, Japan and South Korea. What's common about them? They are not Atlantic countries, which is why they are part of NATO plus and not NATO. You may ask, what's the difference? For starters, no mutual defense. NATO members are bound by Article 5. This article says an attack on one member is an attack on all. It's called collective security. NATO plus members do not get this shield. What they do get is this: more intelligence sharing, more weaponry and more military cooperation. Now to the final question: what should India do about this pitch? Well, right now, it's a recommendation. Such an offer has not been made by the US government. Neither has New Delhi expressed interest in it. But recently, there have been exchanges. In 2019, India held its first meeting with NATO. It was more political than military, sort of like getting to know each other. Then in March 2023, there was another meeting. America's NATO envoy said the door was opening for more engagement with India. But again, NATO plus wasn't mentioned. So how should New Delhi see this recommendation? With a lot of doubts. Politically, the recommendation shows India's importance to the West, how it sees India as a rising power, but there is a downside. The panel also sees India as a means to an end, that end being China. Let's face it, that's a dangerous place to be because NATO is famous for using and throwing allies. And that's just one part of the problem. India's foreign policy is built on strategic autonomy, meaning New Delhi is close to everyone, to the US, to Europe, to Russia. But joining NATO plus would limit that autonomy. It would push India closer to the West. Chances are that will hamper relations with Russia. You see, neutrality is very delicate. And right now, India is in the perfect place. It is a member of the Quad, but it is also a member of the SCO. It is invited to the G7 summit. Yet, it is also part of BRICS. Joining NATO plus would tip that balance. Another issue is the level of commitment and cooperation required. Just look at the other NATO plus members. Australia and New Zealand fought 2 world wars with America. That's how old the partnership is. Japan and South Korea are part of America's nuclear umbrella, and the US-Israel relationship doesn't need an introduction. The US is Israel's biggest political and military partner. See the problem? India's relationship with the US is very different. It is not based on shared history or treaties or culture. It is based on strategic considerations. And what is New Delhi's strategic consideration right now? To create a multipolar world, to build closer relationships with Russia and the West. NATO doesn't permit that. Neither does NATO plus. It's an alliance rooted in the Cold War era of binaries. You are either with us or against us. Such an attitude doesn't serve India's foreign policy. Does that mean India should cut off all engagements? Absolutely not. NATO is the most powerful alliance in human history. Engaging with it is common sense. But joining it? That's the red line India shouldn't cross. There are ways to deepen engagement without joining NATO plus, like the Quad or simply bilateral cooperation. That gives India more wiggle room in foreign policy. There's big news in the US. Joe Biden has struck a debt deal. He should finally be able to raise the debt ceiling, meaning no default, no doomsday for the global economy. The deal was struck over the weekend by Joe Biden and House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. The full document was released on Sunday. Now comes the big task, convincing lawmakers to pass the bill. Biden has called the deal a compromise. McCarthy has called it worthy of the American people. Both sides have made some concessions. The key is to convince hardliners in both parties that those concessions were necessary.
We've just spoke with Speaker McCarthy, and we've reached a bipartisan budget agreement that we're ready to move to the full Congress. And I think it's a really important step forward. And this is a deal that's good news, I believe you'll see, for the American people. The agreement prevents the worst possible crisis a default for the first time in our nation's history.
I'm not sure who you're talking to because we did a conference call with our conference and over 95% were overwhelmingly excited about what they see. They're getting the text today in the process.
So what's in this all-important deal? The most important part is the debt ceiling itself. It has suspended until January 2025, which means the US government can borrow again. That deadline is also important for Biden. He faces re-election in November 2024, so he won't have to negotiate another debt ceiling, at least not in this term. Let me quickly run you through the rest. Non-military spending for 2024 will be the same as 2023, meaning a cap on spending. But in 2025, it can be increased by 1%. That will make the Republicans happy. At the same time, spending on military and veterans will increase. That's something Biden pushed for. He's also agreed to slash spending on tax collection. Biden had set aside $80 billion to hunt tax evaders. That's been reduced by $10 billion. Most Social Security and Medicare schemes have been retained. But there are new work requirements for government aid. Like I said, both sides have compromised. But it doesn't matter what we think. What matters is whether hardline Republicans and Democrats will support it. Especially Republicans. They hold a wafer-thin majority in the US House. Plus, Kevin McCarthy is not in absolute control. He himself was elected Speaker on the 15th ballot. So the question is, can McCarthy get the bill passed? If he can't, all this will be for nothing. We'll be back to square one. So right now, that's the biggest worry for Biden, getting this deal passed in the House and Senate. The stock markets have rebounded after news of the deal trickled in. Oil prices have also recovered. So the short-term impact has been good. But what about the long term? How will this deal affect the US economy? Many experts are worried about the spending cap. Expenditure for 2024 has been capped at the 2023 levels. That could hurt American recovery. Bloomberg says there is a 65% risk of recession in the US. To avoid that, spending must increase. It's Economics 101. If you want to reverse an economic downturn, you must spend more. This deal prevents that. Spending will not increase next year. And the year after, it will increase by just 1%. Problem number 2 is liquidity. Once the deal is passed, the US Treasury will hit overdrive. It will have to raise a lot of money in very little time. How do they do that? By issuing bonds to the private sector. It's normal business for the Treasury, but this time the scale is massive. If the Treasury usually issues 10 bonds in one day, it will now have to issue 20. This could suck liquidity out of the system, reduce the amount on money held by the private sector. And what happens when liquidity disappears? Again, slow down. Bank of America says the impact will be equivalent to a 25 basis point interest hike. That's not good news for the US economy, especially not right now. All these challenges tell us one thing. The US debt ceiling is dangerous. Maybe it promotes bipartisanship and accountability, but only if the leaders are mature enough. In modern-day America, that doesn't seem to be the case. Leaders have repeatedly weaponized the debt ceiling, used it to politically blackmail the sitting president. So maybe that should be the biggest takeaway from this crisis, the irrelevance for the debt ceiling. Speaking of debt, China has its own share of trouble as well. Local governments in China are drowning in debt. They are in a pretty bad place. Just how bad? Let me tell you. The city of Wuhan has decided to name and shame borrowers. They have printed a list of 259 entities in the state newspaper. How much money do they owe? Around 300 million yuan, which is around $42 million. Some of these loans date back to December 2018. And who are these borrowers? A range of businesses, car companies, financial bureaus, real estate firms, all of them owe money to the Wuhan government. This is the first time the city has resorted to such a strategy. The desperation is almost childlike. Think back to your school days. Remember when talkative students had their names written on the blackboard? This is very similar. So the question is, what's happening in Wuhan? Is the city running out of cash? Wuhan's revenue in the first quarter of this year was $7 billion. On paper, that's a lot. but compare it to last year. The revenue is 8.5% less compared to Q1 of 2022. So liquidity crunch could be one reason. You need money to pay your own debt. The Wuhan government has asked these 250 plus entities to repay the loans immediately. But here's the problem. Wuhan is just a small part of a much bigger issue. Like I said, China's local governments are drowning in debt. How much money are we talking about? According to Goldman Sachs, $23 trillion. That's how big the debt pile is. Let me put that number in perspective. China's entire GDP is around $12 trillion. So the total government debt is twice the national GDP. This raises two questions. Number one, why were so many loans taken? And number two, will there be a crisis down the line? Most of these loans were taken in the last 2 decades. That's when China began a building spree. Ports, highways, high-rises, China was building at the rate of knots. That infrastructure push was backed by loans. But will it backfire? That's where experts are divided. You see, most of this debt is owned by state banks. So the central government in Beijing has a lot of power over it. They can just ask the banks to roll over the payments or maybe extend the deadline. But for how long? Eventually, these local governments will have to repay, and that's where revenue is a problem. Local government debt was 120% of revenue in 2022. In some cities, it's even worse, like Hegang in northeastern China. By 2021, their total debt had risen to 30 billion yuan. That's 230% of their income. Think of it this way. You have taken a lot of loans from your brother. Your debt is now more than your income. The good news is the lender is family. Maybe he will extend the deadline. The bad news is you will have to pay eventually. For local governments, that means tightening the screws, smaller budgets, more taxes and lesser expenses. Also more ways of raising funds, which brings us back to Wuhan. The local government's move shows how desperate they are for cash. Any money is good money right now. Now let's talk about Turkey. The results are in. The Turkish people have spoken. It's 5 more years of Recep Tayyip Erdogan as president. These elections are the biggest threat to his power. He was taken all the way by his challenger, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu. It came down to a second round runoff, but eventually Erdogan triumphed. Despite his botched handling of the economy, despite his slow reaction to the earthquakes in February, the Turkish people have overlooked all his failings and given Erdogan another chance. How free and fair were the elections? The opposition claims they were not. Kılıçdaroğlu says they were the most unfair in years, but he hasn't disputed the outcome. So Erdogan has won his 11th election in a row, his last election apparently. Here's our report.
This was the Turkish capital Ankara last night. Thousands gathered to congratulate their leader. Recep Tayyip Erdogan has won again. He will remain Turkey's president till 2028. With this victory, he enters his 3rd decade in power.
We are very happy, full of joy. I can't even contain myself. I thank God.
Today is our happy day. Our president has won. I feel like I'm going on a pilgrimage to Mecca.
The victory is ours. We are very happy. Bye, Mr. Kemal. Thank God, Islam has won.
She says Islam has won. That's because of Erdogan's politics. Erdogan is unabashedly a nationalist and centers his politics around religion. He has a strongman image to boot. This persona and his longevity were always going to help him, despite the disasters that Turkey is going through. Economically, Turkey is in big trouble. The lira fell to a record low against the US dollar today. It's trading at 20.10 to the dollar. It's a reflection of Erdogan's economic mismanagement. He's overseen the lira's value fall by 90% over the last decade. His unorthodox economic policies have been blamed for the lira's crash and record inflation in the country. Erdogan has also overseen a sharp turn to political Islam while in power. Away from the secular politics Turkey had embraced when it became a republic in 1923. Erdogan has also been chipping away at democratic institutions over the years. He has turned Turkey from a parliamentary democracy to a presidential one. He's concentrated the power of the presidential office. Overall, Erdogan has done much to erode Turkey's republican credentials. The opposition had vowed to undo this damage, but Turkish voters still narrowly rejected them. Erdogan won with 52% of the vote in this runoff election. His opponent, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, got about 48%. It was Erdogan's toughest ever election. He faced a coalition of opposition parties with Kılıçdaroğlu at their helm. The secular candidate vowed to fix Turkey. He pushed Erdogan to the wire, but Erdogan still prevailed. He delivered a diplomatic speech after his victory.
No one has lost today. All 85 million have won. As a requirement of the responsibility given to us by our nation, we are not offended, resentful, angry, or enraged with anyone. It is now time to put aside all the debates and conflicts regarding the election period and unite around our national goals and national dreams.
His opponent, Kılıçdaroğlu, has accepted the loss. However, he has vowed to keep fighting for democracy.
The will of the people to change the authoritarian rule is clear despite all the pressures. Now I have something to ask you, for yourselves, for your children, for the retirees, for our mothers and fathers, for our farmers and traders' brothers. Support the democracy struggle.
Erdogan has said he will not contest again, that he will give up power in 2028. Turkey has reposed faith in the tried and tested. But what will another 5 years of rule by the Turkish strongman mean for his country?
Closer to Turkey, tensions are growing between Iran and the Taliban. They are trading gunfire. Over the weekend, lethal clashes broke out at the border. At least 3 people have died, 2 Iranian border guards and 1 Taliban fighter. Threats are being issued by both sides. The situation is being described as dangerous by some observers. But what triggered the tensions in the first place? Well, this dispute is about water, specifically the Helmand River. It is the longest river of Afghanistan, stretching more than 2,000 miles. Both Iran and Afghanistan depend on the Helmand. It originates in the high mountains of the Hindu Kush and feeds into the wetlands of Iran. In recent weeks, the river has sparked tensions. Iran says it is not getting access to Helmand's waters. It accuses the Taliban of throttling the river's flow. The Taliban denies the charge, but over the weekend, the dispute took an ugly turn. There was shooting at Nimroz, at a border checkpoint. Nimroz is a border province of Afghanistan. We don't know exactly what happened. Both sides accuse the other of opening fire. After the clashes, Iran is said to have closed an important border crossing, the Milak-Zaranj post. This is a commercial crossing. It is away from the area where the clashes happened. It is believed Iran closed this post in response to the firing. So it is clear, all is not well between Iran and Afghanistan. This is not the first time this has happened. The dispute is over Helmand's waters. This is an old one. Its origins can be traced back to the 1940s and 50s. During those years, Afghanistan built 2 major dams along the Helmand. This had alarmed the Iranians because the country had experienced intense droughts. In 1973, a water-sharing treaty was signed, but the dispute was never resolved. Iran says the treaty is not being honored. In recent weeks, Iranian President Ibrahim Raisi has issued repeated warnings. I have the statements with me. Listen to this. This is Raisi talking about the water dispute with the Taliban, and I quote, "We will not allow the rights of our people to be violated. I warn the rulers of Afghanistan to immediately give the people their water rights. Take my words seriously now or don't complain later."
I warn the rulers of Afghanistan to immediately give the people of Sistan Baluchistan their water rights. The Afghan side should allow our experts to go for evaluation straight away. If our experts confirm the lack of water, we have nothing else to say. Otherwise, we will not allow the rights of our people to be violated.
So what was the Taliban's response? Well, Kabul hasn't taken the criticism kindly. They have issued their own threats. Again, I have some statements. This is from the Taliban's defense ministry. Making excuses for war and negative actions is not in the interest of any of the parties. Kabul rejects the charge that it hasn't honored the treaty, so neither side is mincing their words. And this dispute could worsen bilateral ties. In recent months, both sides have made progress. In February, Iran took a major decision. It handed over the Afghan embassy in Tehran to the Taliban. Iran also accepted Taliban-appointed diplomats. It wasn't a formal recognition of the Taliban regime, but the move brought the two sides closer. The water wars could reverse this progress. Reports say both sides have held talks. Attempts are being made to diffuse tensions. Remains to be seen if diplomacy can solve this. New Delhi will be watching very closely. India depends on Iran for its engagements with Afghanistan. This year, India shipped humanitarian assistance to Afghans. Wheat consignments were delivered via the Chabahar port. Last year, India had sent a technical team to Kabul to coordinate the delivery of humanitarian assistance. So India will be monitoring the situation at the borders. This is a developing story, and we'll keep a track of the latest developments. Now let's talk about space, the final frontier. Turns out the race to conquer that frontier is heating up. Over the last week, we've seen a flurry of space-related activity. Let's start with India. The Indian Space Research Organisation, or ISRO, has launched a satellite today. The GSLV F-12 rocket successfully took to the skies. It took off from the Satish Dhawan Space Centre in Sriharikota in the state of Andhra Pradesh. The rocket carried the NVS-01 Next Generation Navigation Satellite into orbit. The satellite has both civilian and military applications. It helps with navigation, positioning and timing services. It even carries an indigenous atomic clock for precise timekeeping. Some other big news greeted Indian space enthusiasts as well. ISRO's chief confirmed that the Chandrayaan-3 lunar exploration mission will launch this July. The planned date is July 12. If successful, it will expand India's footprint on the moon and certify India's growing space credentials. Of course, India isn't the only nation looking to the stars. South Korea launched its first homegrown commercial-grade rocket last Thursday. It ejected several satellites to observe cosmic radiation. On Friday, NASA launched a pair of its tropic storm research satellites. Russia launched a Soyuz rocket carrying a Condor reconnaissance satellite on Saturday. And even China had some big space news to share today.
The General Command has studied and decided to target the launch of the Shenzhou 16 manned spacecraft at 9:31 Beijing time on May 30th. The flight crew consists of astronauts Jing Haipeng, Zhu Yangchu and Gui Haichao. Jing Haipeng served as the commander.
Of particular interest is the third astronaut.
Payload expert Gui Haichao is a professor at Beihang University. He is mainly responsible for the on-orbit operation of space science experimental payloads. He received professional training in fields such as science and aerospace engineering and has rich operational experience.
This is the first time China is sending a civilian into space. Every other Chinese astronaut has been a member of the People's Liberation Army. This marks a new stage in Chinese space activities. And that's not all.
Recently, the lunar landing phase of China's manned lunar exploration project has been launched and implemented. The overall goal is to achieve the first Chinese landing on the moon by 2030, conduct lunar scientific research and related technical experiments, and master key technologies such as Earth-to-Moon round-trip, short-term lunar surface stay, and human-machine joint exploration, and complete multiple tasks such as landing, patrol, mining, research and return.
Yes, China is also ramping up its lunar mission. It reiterated its goal of sending people to the moon by 2030. We had told you about Beijing's lunar plans a few days ago and about how the US is wary of China's growing space capabilities. That was on full display over the weekend. Brigadier General Jesse Morehouse of the US Space Command made a statement, and I quote, The United States of America is ready to fight tonight in space if we have to. Morehouse cited Russia's aggression and China's vision to become a dominant space power as the reason. He said it left the US with no choice but to prepare for orbital skirmishes. And what is the US doing to prepare? Developing anti-satellite technologies. Think about all the satellite launches over the last week we mentioned. They show how essential satellites are to our day-to-day lives. And countries know this. They know that enemy nations can be crippled by taking out their satellites. Russia and China are building spacecraft capable of anti-satellite operations. Russia, China, the US and India have tested ground-based anti-satellite missiles. It's a new avenue for war, and countries are getting ready. Add this to the rapid rocket launches, and we are seeing a new competition emerge, a new scramble for the moon, a new space race, and this time, India is right there among the competitors. And now let's turn our attention to Canada. It is burning. Its eastern city of Halifax has declared an emergency. It is suffering from wildfires. Homes are going up in flames. There are power outages and hundreds of people are being evacuated. The fire has sent a huge pall of smoke over the city, but this port city is not the only one facing the brunt of wildfires. Hundreds of other wildfires are burning in Canada. Why is this happening and what measures is Canada taking? Our next report tells you.
That's fire.
What you just saw is a dashcam video. It shows a car being driven through Halifax. This is an eastern Canadian city and a wildfire is ravaging the port city. Burning out of control. These visuals are shocking. But they aren't the only ones. Look at this huge pall of smoke. This too is a result of the same wildfire, which sent up a huge cloud of smoke over the port city. This looks scary because it is. There are flames everywhere. Roads are affected. Houses are burning. There are power outages. All in all, the situation is hazardous. And Halifax has declared a state of local emergency, which will be in effect for at least a week. Meanwhile, evacuations are underway. But this horrific experience is not limited to this eastern Canadian city. It is being shared by Western Canadian province too, Alberta. Except here, the situation is much worse. Unprecedented wildfires are raging in Alberta, which too has declared an emergency. This province is home to 4 million people, tens of thousands of whom have been displaced. Their homes are burning. Millions of hectares of land has been charred by fire. About 2 weeks ago, this is what the authorities said.
Our peak burning period, which is when the temperatures are at their highest and the fuels are at their driest, is still in front of us.
They were right. Their skies are still choking in smoke. There is no end in sight for these record-breaking fires. Question is, why is this happening? During the spring, the snow begins to melt. This exposes tree branches and dead leaves underneath. Experts call this fuel because they are flammable. And warm temperatures and dry conditions only increase the flammability. Both of which Canada saw this year. It dived into summer, with record-breaking temperatures and a terrible heat wave, especially in areas like Alberta and British Columbia, which saw both record-breaking heat and below-average rainfall, which was even 75 to 100% less than usual in some areas. This just made the entire situation worse. And this is alarming. Parts of Canada do see wildfires, but they don't usually come this early. What's more, they aren't usually this spread out. Authorities are working to control these wildfires, but this time it's challenging because big wildfires aren't concentrated to a specific part. There are a lot of big ones spread across different territories. About 100 wildfires burned just Alberta, and Canada is doing its bit to get things under control. But matters are only getting worse. Much of the fire season is still left. Experts say there is no end in sight. It seems like there will be months before the situation comes under control, which only feels like a trailer for what is to come. As our climate warms, we expect to see more fire. More power disruptions, more burning houses, more people displaced, and many more clouds of smoke. Unseasonal heat has become more frequent, probable, and intense. All because of human action. Our world is on fire. Question is, when will we wake up and smell the smoke? For our last story today, let's talk about Venice, the floating city of Italy, which is known for its beautiful bridges and winding canals. But this weekend, it woke up to an unusual sight. Its central waterway has turned green. Now, let's set our expectations right. The Venice canals don't have crystal clear blue waters. Everyone knows that. We're used to their dirty, dark green colors. But this time, the canal water has turned bright green. It feels like Hulk took a bath in the water, or that Shrek the ogre made the canal its secret home. You would even expect Kermit the Frog to suddenly emerge out of the water, but with an army of several other green frogs. Because this green patch doesn't seem like the work of just one wholesome frog. Don't believe us? Here's a report.
This is Venice, the city of canals, arguably one of Italy's most picturesque cities. But now it has an odd green problem. Look at these visuals. This is the city's central waterway, and now a patch of water in it has turned fluorescent green. Perplexing, right? The Venetians can relate. They have no idea where this green patch came from, but they're quite keen on finding out. Local authorities have begun an urgent investigation. They've collected water samples which will be tested for answers. But while the world awaits them, it has turned to conspiracy theories. Many speculations are floating across the internet, but one of them seems plausible. It suggests that the green water is a mark of protest, that environmental activists released dye into the water, and that this dye turned water green. This is not difficult to believe. After all, a wave of disruptive activism has swept across Europe, and environmental awareness groups have hit Italy as well. This month itself, a climate action group stepped into Rome's Trevi fountain. It's a popular tourist spot, and its water was mixed with diluted charcoal. Soon the water of this beautiful fountain turned black. But even if we stick to the color green, this is not the first time Italy has witnessed something like this. In fact, it feels like history is being repeated. Let's go back to 1968. This is an Argentine artist named Nicolas Garcia Uriburu. He dyed the waters of the Grand Canal in Venice green. Why? To raise awareness of ecological issues. Venice has been of particular interest to environmental activists because it is one of the world's most fragile cities, constantly threatened by rising sea levels. It was hit by major floods in 2019. While those waters receded, its problems haven't. The city is literally sinking. So it has now come up with an ambitious $6 billion plan to save Venice from flooding. The city has also instituted strict rules for tourists. The authorities want their help in preserving the environment. But this hasn't calmed environmentalists. They want the government to do better. And some have resorted to chaos to gain eyeballs. It's not clear whether this incident is an act of protest or not. The investigation has only just begun. So far, it indicates that people need not be scared. Investigators say this green patch has been caused by a harmless dye called fluorescein. It's used to track the flow of water. This substance is not uncommon. But here's the catch. Usually experts use 1 spoonful of this dye to analyze water flow. But in this case, it seems like at least 1 kg of the dye was dumped in the water. Talk about getting your calculations wrong. But was it deliberate or an accident? It's difficult to believe that something like this just slipped into the canal like an oops moment. Whatever may be the reason, as long as a giant green squid monster is not releasing ink into the water, there's no need to feel blue over this fluorescent green.
And with that, it's time for Vantage Shots, images that tell the story. Starting with Chile, thousands of people gathered in Santiago to break a Guinness World Record. People formed the largest human image of a bicycle. In the US, Olympic champion Carissa Moore won women's title at Surf Ranch Pro, and SpaceX launched its latest Falcon 9 rocket on Saturday. And finally, what makes May 29th significant? Taking you back in history. On this day in 1953, for the first time, Two explorers reached the top of the world's highest mountain, the Everest. Edmund Hillary was a beekeeper from New Zealand, and Tenzing Norgay was a skilled climber from Nepal. Mount Everest Day marks their remarkable accomplishment. We leave you with that. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.
Welcomed and congratulated by their fellow members of the expedition. Poor Tenzing descended from his glory into the center of a minor political storm. He was born in Nepal and grew up in India, and both nations are now at loggerheads to claim him as their national. However, Tenzing was unruffled when Colonel Hunt congratulated him and Hillary. Two unassuming men had climbed the 29,000-foot monarch of the Himalayas.
Moving through the clouds there, Falcon 9 has successfully lifted off. There's that gorgeous view on your screen there of the...
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony.
Becoming a UK PM.
Well, it's not like that we are going to get the Kohinoor back. But at least India is on its way to the top. Huh?
But Gautam sir, there's actually not much to celebrate.
Why not? An Indian is ruling the UK.
Indian leaders in third countries often tend to overcompensate for their minority handicap. For example, Sunak's Home Secretary of Indian origin, Suella Braverman, disapproved of India-UK free trade because it would encourage people immigrating to the UK, and the majority of whom were Indians. Structurally, India and UK have passed baggage, but still hasn't been resolved. And that is why...
Ladies and gentlemen, India needs to significantly temper its expectations from Rishi Sunak. Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first-of-its-kind global show with an Indian perspective.
Mismanaged vaccination drive, broken healthcare systems, citizens taking matters into their own hands. India's failure in managing the COVID-19 crisis is staggering.
Want stories but without the West spin on it? Presenting Vantage with me, Palki Sharma, a first-of-its-kind global show with an Indian perspective.